of law is not just some lawyer's turn of phrase. It is the very foundation of our democracy. The essence of the rule of law is that like cases are treated alike. That there not be one rule for Democrats and another for Republicans, one rule for the powerful, another for the powerless, one rule for the rich and another for the poor, or different rules depending upon one's race or ethnicity. To serve as Attorney General at this critical time is a calling I am honored and eager to answer.
So yeah, now it's clean up on aisle 45 time. And for a long while yet, it is going to be clean up on aisle 45.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 118 of Cleanup on Aisle 45. It's Wednesday, April 26, 2023, a red letter day. I'm your host, Allison Gill.
And I'm Pete Strzok. We've got a lot to cover today, including a motion found by the Fulton County District Attorney to disqualify an attorney for 10, as many as God's commandments, 10 of the fraudulent electors in Georgia. Tucker Carlson is leaving Fox News after a long storied career and after a settlement is reached in the Dominion defamation case. An agreement is reached between Alvin Bragg and Jim Jordan for the testimony of Mark Pomerantz and an update on broader dissemination of the Teixeira classified material than was previously known.
Yeah, and that's a big story, and we're going to hit that in the D block, but we have so much to cover today, and we're all like, can we just go home early today? Tucker's out of Fox, and we're just all sort of super happy about that. But as the reporting, keep in mind, we record this show on Monday, and I'm sure more reporting will come out about the reasons, but we'll talk about that when we talk about the Dominion and Fox settlement. Apparently, they aren't really related. It's got more to do with the Abby Grossman lawsuit. But we'll get into that in a little bit. But first, we want to thank our new patrons. Patrons make this show possible. If you want to become a patron, then get this feed ad-free, get pre-sale tickets to things like our VIP cocktail reception coming up in D.C. this weekend for White House Correspondents' Weekend. Join us for our, randomly scheduled Q&A happy hour, Zoom calls, all that stuff for as little as $1 an episode. And you can tell us what your name is going to be, kind of like pub trivia. And I'm going to read the names of our new patrons this week. We have Andrea Singleton, Brendan Murphy, Brianne L., Danielle Citron, Edward Grandy, Heidi O'Connor, Janine Iorga, or Yorga, John Hirsch, John Butler, Karen Fitzsimmons, Karen Hops, Kelvin, like the temperature, Mike Walker, Nancy Madden, Nurse Ratchet, Rhonda Burr, Tish, Wendy Mellick, and vote for the biggest D you can find. Thank you for that one. So again, patreon.com, I know, patreon.com/aisle45pod. That's AISLE45POD, and you can help make this show happen because we couldn't do it without you. All right, let's kick this show off with the 11-page motion filed by Fani Willis in the Fulton County District Attorney's investigation into 2020 Republican election interference. And the title, normally when you look at the title, they're pretty short. This one's pretty long. This is Motion to disqualify attorney Kimberly Burrows Dubrow in her simultaneous representation of multiple parties in this matter and to prohibit her from any further participation in this matter pursuant to Georgia Rules of Professional Conduct, which are Rules 1.6, 1.7, and 1.9, and other relevant law. So this is a big deal, and it was radio silence since about January 24th when Fani Willis said that, indictment decisions were imminent. Of course, that is the government and investigative definition of imminent, not newsworthy or SVU definition of imminent. So let's talk about this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it clearly explains what some of the delay is. And I mean, what it sounds like, and we can talk about some of the details, is as they were firming up their case, I believe getting ready to indict, they started talking to, in particular, some of the electors and some of the potential false electors, looking at their statements and potentially reaching out to them. And it came to light that some of the electors, when they talked to him and presumably asked the question, well, why didn't you ever respond to this offer of immunity, or why didn't you consider it? Some of the electors apparently said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Offer of immunity? I never heard such a thing. And it turns out that a lot of these people were all being represented by this one same person, this one attorney, who, at least it appears from this filing, was not telling her various clients, who she clearly has a bit of a, more than a bit of a conflict, that the government, in this case, the district attorney, had offered immunity in exchange for their testimony. So, I know this is in the form of a filing alleging, a violation of rules of professional conduct and seeking to bar her from participation. But I do start to wonder whether or not you start to encroach on criminal obstruction. I mean, at some point, this is more than just, I didn't heed my professional responsibility to my various clients. It starts to look like, actively obstructing a case. And, I am not a Georgia law expert, but this strikes me as more than just sloppy representation or, having kind of unresolvable conflicts between various clients. And it just looks dirty. But, the short answer to all this is getting to the bottom of this clearly explains why the delay, to the extent we were kind of wondering, when is Georgia going to come to the table with any sort of charges? And it would seem to me that these are exactly the kind of things that Fani Willis would want to get to the bottom of. And if there are electors now finding out that, in fact, they had been offered immunity or some sort of, advantageous treatment to them, that upon hearing that, they may want to say, oh, well, you know what? I'll take you up on that. Let's sit down and talk. And if that's the case, then, there's a whole nother round of grand jury testimony and more information coming in.
Yeah, and there would have to be. So, let's talk about this for a little bit, because if you're going to represent more than one person, those people can't have a conflict, right? You can't have one person testifying to one thing or against the other person. Or have that, they have to be singing off the same sheet of music. We talked about this a lot during the Mueller investigation, when there was a lot of musical lawyering going on with, like Priebus and Bannon, and I think a guy named William Burke was representing a large group of people, and people had to drop out of that quote unquote joint defense agreement in order to flip or cooperate. And that seems to be what's happening in this case. Now, this isn't the first time Fani Willis has had a problem with this lawyer. She's working at a law firm. She's a partner in a law firm. Her name is Dubrow, and she's working with somebody named Pearson. And at first, Pearson and Dubrow jointly wanted to represent 11 fraudulent electors, including David Schaefer, who's the head of the GOP party in Georgia. And Fani said, no, there's a conflict of interest because David Schaefer is not similarly situated as the other 10 electors, because he's talked to bigger names and, his hands are a little more dirty. They didn't really directly say that, but they said he's differently situated. And the judge agreed and said, look, you can both represent Schaefer or you can both represent the 10, but you can't represent both. So they decided to split the baby, right? That Pearson would represent Schaefer and Dubrow would represent these other 10 folks. Well, now it looks like these other 10 folks are having issues within that small group. Well, it's actually a very large group. I have never heard of a lawyer representing 10 people at once, like 3 maybe, but 10 is pretty out there. And so now there's some, according to very recent interviews, as recent as 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago maybe, with these electors, that there are some electors who are like, look, we know that some of these other electors that you're representing committed crimes that we weren't party to, or violated laws that we weren't party to. You can't really, I guess you can only allege somebody has committed a crime. And that's a problem. And that's when we found out they were questioned about whether or not they had received their immunity offer, which the court ordered last year. The court said, hey, and this was a temperature-taking immunity offer to see if anybody would be willing to flip and cooperate or sign a plea agreement or plead out or, whatever, or to get some sort of immunity, limited use immunity, whatever kind of immunity. And as you said, they found out very recently, that immunity offer was never made. And if you're a lawyer and an offer is made to your clients for whatever, a settlement offer, an immunity offer, and you do not present that offer to your clients, that is explosively huge. That is a bad, that is bad lawyering. You can't do that. You must present these offers to your client. Now you can say, You can advise your client on whether to take the offer or not and, talk to them a little bit about it. But the interesting thing here is my first thought was, who is funding? Who's paying for Pearson and Dubrow? And I went and I did a little research, and it turns out the Georgia Republican Party, which is led by David Schaefer, is paying the bills. And so that is where my question came in, which is just what you brought up, Pete. Is there criminal obstruction here? Is David Schaefer paying for these lawyers to inhibit them from offering immunity deals so that they don't flip on him or other electors within that group of 10? And this has to be resolved before indictments can be brought, because if there's poor representation or bad lawyering, or any criminal defendants' rights are trampled upon, they aren't offered their deals properly, then it's ripe for appeal, right?
Yeah, it is. And, one of the kind of core fundamental components of any sort of representation relationship, and it's the core of any bar that you go to across the United States, is an attorney's fiduciary duty to their client. And in this case, Dubrow has, 10, maybe more, but certainly 10 that we're aware of in this filing, clients, many of which might have claims against the other, right? I mean, it could be the kind, we're all, you and me and 8 other people are involved in a conspiracy. I might have something, if I want to make a deal, because we potentially are all members of the same conspiracy, I might have inculpatory testimony about you. You might have inculpatory testimony about me. So one attorney trying to advise any one client when all these different clients have interests against one another, you're at an ethical impossibility right there. I mean, you cannot effectively function ethically as an attorney when to advise different people whose interests are not aligned. And so I don't know how this was not, I mean, I guess some of it, maybe these electors, fake electors, were not really savvy about the law. But the first thing I would be concerned about if I had some sort of representation is like, wait a minute, I'm not, to the extent that there's some allegation of criminal misconduct here, I'm not comfortable with one attorney representing all of us, because we were all involved in, potentially a large conspiracy together. And so this is just, though, a microcosm when you step back and you look at what a significant test all of the Trump administration was to the various, bar administrative processes across the land. I mean, we saw Sidney Powell's bar discipline get thrown out by a judge in Texas. We saw, on the other hand, Michigan stand up very, very strongly between ultimately Gretchen Whitmer, but Dana Nessel, I guess the Attorney General, taking the lead on filing complaints. But you see in different states a different willingness. And then, of course, out in Colorado, essentially calling Jen Ellis a liar 10 times more over. So you're seeing the bar accountability process being put to the test, some states standing up and doing the right thing, others really being tried. So I'm curious to see, not only in the, across the board here in Georgia, how this plays out in an administrative context with Dubrow and Schaefer and others, whether or not this plays out, to your point, is there a criminal aspect to this? Is there a conspiracy or obstruction aspect to this? But it really throws even more of a spotlight on the legal profession and their ability internally, through their checks and balances and licensing and, through the bar, their ability to sanction this behavior or not.
Yeah. And last year, Fani Willis said to Judge McBurney, hey, there's no way she can possibly represent 10 people and they're all exactly, there's not being any conflict of interest. And McBurney ruled, look, we can't litigate that right now. It's a hypothetical at this point. Come back to me later if there's a legit conflict of interest. And here we are. She's coming back. So I don't think McBurney's going to take too kindly to this, because there were warnings early on about this. Now, the judge has given Dubrow, the attorney, until May 5th to respond, which is a little over a week from now. And we know that a new grand jury will be seated that first week of May in Fulton County. So I'm assuming that this is actually going to have to be resolved before any charges are brought. But again, I am not a Georgia law expert. I don't know if you can file the charges and then or unseal the charges, file them, unseal them, prior to, and then resolve this later, or if Fani Willis is going to want to have all these T's crossed and I's dotted before she brings charges in probably one of the most consequential cases in the history of the United States for a district attorney.
Yeah, I can't imagine her doing anything before she gets to the bottom of all of this. So to the extent there's any sort of litigation or any sort of, follow up with these various fake electors, granting any of them immunity, just sort of getting them new counsel, negotiating the terms of immunity, getting them in there, getting their testimony, bringing them in front of the grand jury. As again, you're absolutely right. Something this big and this consequential, you want to have every last thing nailed down. There's no rush. I mean, comparatively, there's in the context of years, there may be a rush, but in the context of weeks or months, there's not a rush. So get it all right. Get everybody who might have, upon learning this new information, some desire to talk and make a deal with the government, get their statements down, figure out what additional investigation comes out of that. And then with all those facts, then sit down and figure out what you're going to charge and take that to the grand jury. So I think it is hard for me to envision a scenario where Fani Willis does not do that, where this does not easily push into the next grand jury. The advantage is, Judge McBurney is sort of a constant through line in all this. He has the history of all of these issues. He understands what has been said and what has been ordered and done and not done. So I think that bodes well for getting to the bottom of some of these shenanigans. But I do think, in my mind, learning of this, it easily puts any sort of charges coming out of Georgia into the summertime. I just would not, as an investigator, I would want to pursue all this and get it all nailed down, lock people in with new testimony if necessary, before even considering all right, what charges do we think we have?
Yeah, and put together any of those immunity deals if they're needed, and you'd have to utilize and follow up on those interviews, and it's going to be a minute. I agree with you. And I mean, we could see a situation where they sort out the lawyer thing and get all their charges and ducks in a row and file, and then maybe supersede if they find criminal wrongdoing with this lawyering, or a separate charge altogether against the lawyers that have nothing to do with the actual January 6th case. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But very, very interesting filing from the long silent Fani Willis down in Georgia. All right. We are going to talk a little bit about Fox News and Dominion and some really, really great news that came down for democracy. But we have to take a quick break. Everybody stick around. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. By now, we've all heard that Fox and the Dominion settled the Dominion defamation case, and Monday, Fox News, just today, as we tape, fired both Tucker Carlson and his executive producer, Justin Wells. So last week, Fox settled with Dominion for $787.5 million US dollars. And some half-assed apology last Tuesday. But the thing that I guess gets me about all this is that, and we talked about this some on the bonus episode, that, I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I get why Dominion would take this money. There is nothing certain. However much of a rock-solid slam dunk case you think you have, there's always uncertainty about one member of the jury who might be a holdout, who might not be able to be convinced. And when you're talking, $750 million, I can understand why Dominion would want to take that. It is a little bit unsatisfying to not get some apologies, to not get some, the display of material that, by all accounts, there was some additional material that had not been made public. But the flip side of that is, this is just the beginning. This is the first sort of shot across the bow. There are more lawsuits coming from Smartmatic, from various individuals. So I don't think this is the beginning of litigation for Fox, not the end. So there's more coming. And, the fallout has started. I mean, when you look at Tucker Carlson, there's some question, I think, based on the reporting that's coming in, whether or not this relates to the Dominion settlement. I mean, it's clear that it was certainly unexpected. His last show on Friday, he was talking about, I'll see you again on Monday. Some media accounts indicated that, as early as this morning, they were planning on the taping the show tonight. But it's certainly, he isn't going to get his sort of, curtain call, his chance to thank his viewers. It was, show up to work on Monday and that's it, you're gone. And so it, by some accounts coming out, again, it was not so much Dominion, but potentially the statements that had come up in the context of that discovery. One, that his statements that he had made that were very derisive and derogatory towards senior leadership, I assume, including the Murdochs. And then also the other lawsuits that are going on. And that isn't so much the one, Dominion or Smartmatic, but those, things alleging a hostile
Grossman.
Workplace. Right.
Well,
Abby
yeah.
Grossman's lawsuit, sort of indicating just an extraordinarily hostile work environment of just all kinds of rampant sexual harassment that was going on allegedly. So I think, you put all these things together and something happened over the weekend that apparently, if it did come from the top, that whatever it was is like, no, that's it, you're out. And
LA Times is reporting that it was Rupert Murdoch's decision, and he made it this morning. And because otherwise, this is the kind of thing you would want to come out Friday night because their stock is tanking right now. If you're watching the show Succession, we're seeing that happen in real life now. Life is imitating art now instead of the other way around. But we were all like, I think I was live on the Stephanie Miller show when the news came out, and I thought it was fake, right? Up because no one's verified on Twitter, so I can't tell who's reporting what. We all have to take a beat and do a little research on who's reporting things and whether or not that's the actual person who's reporting it. And it was, and so then we were able to say it with confidence, but according to LA Times, it's Rupert Murdoch's call. And some of those quotes, by the way, that you were talking about, because Washington Post is saying that it was stuff in the Dominion case that played a role, including the quote, "Do the executives understand how much credibility and trust we've lost with our audience?" That's what Carlson wrote to a colleague, texted in a message the day after Fox called the election for Joe Biden. That was November 8th, right? And in another message, Carlson referred to management, saying those fuckers are destroying our credibility. That's Rupert Murdoch. And he later wrote, "A combination of incompetent liberals and top leadership with too much pride to back down is what's happening." So this is actually Tucker Carlson arguing that it was bad that we called the race for Joe Biden. And blaming top executives for backing down and for, I guess being too weak to say that. But their stocks are down 5% this morning now.
Yeah. And, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me because you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing with bad news, and it was always true in within the government, but also out, like if you've got bad stuff to come, everybody tries to get it out on a Friday night, like after what used to be the 6:00 news. But when everybody's left for the day on Friday, you get it out there. Saturday is slow. Nobody's really paying attention. It hits the sort of media ecosphere. It kind of bubbles around Saturday, maybe some of the Sunday morning talk shows. And by the time Monday comes around, it's largely been absorbed in sort of whatever, the ripples have diminished. But when you have it hit like it did today, like in the middle of the markets, you get a real, that from a sort of crisis management, communications management perspective, it's a really crappy way to roll this out. So, again, I think we all, tend to assume rational, logical actors. I think it's, of course, possible that, Rupert Murdoch heard about this yesterday, was furious and said, "No, I want him gone. And no, we'll just announce it tomorrow in a, fit of pick or something." But it doesn't, from a strategic perspective, I would sooner let it out in a different way than emerge today, because you couldn't design a more sort of like bombshell sort of way to roll it out than what occurred here. And it does make me wonder, were there things that, as Grossman goes down in the path of her lawsuit and discovery continues, are there new things that were turned over? Is there something more that is coming, particularly when it comes to Carlson? And again, his producer was let go too. And so were there, additional recordings, additional material that just came up that is, we haven't seen or heard yet, but that is so bad that Fox decided, what, we can't wait until next Friday. We can't give Tucker another week on the air. We got to get rid of him today because again, it's a huge splash. And at the end of the day, the money is the bottom line. And if you've dropped 5%, that's a horrible way to roll out the news. And, we're still waiting. There was this reporting in, last week that, perhaps, Maria Bartiromo, that, Dan Bongino had been dropped, but, maybe people like Maria Bartiromo or Judge Janine or others were also on the chopping block as sort of the fallout from the settlement. And we haven't heard that, but, I don't think this is the end of Fox News personalities being shown the door.
Yeah, no. And like you said, they couldn't wait another day. or another week. And so why is that? Which, leads me to believe they know a lot more about this information. We don't have it all than we do. And perhaps something is coming out. Maybe Fox got a call from a journalist saying, hey, I got these tapes. I'm going to release them on, whatever day. And, they had to act. I mean, everything is speculation, but the fact that they couldn't just let him hang around and have maybe a last show or anything like that says that this was urgent in nature. And I think we'll learn more in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah.
All right. We have some other settlement news, don't we?
Yeah, we do. So on the turning to New York and Congress, Alvin Bragg and Jim Jordan reached a settlement in the lawsuit filed by Bragg to block Jim Jordan's subpoena of Mark Pomerantz. And this is from a statement from Bragg, quote, "Our successful stay of the subpoena blocked the immediate deposition and afforded us the time necessary to coordinate with the House Judiciary Committee on an agreement that protects the DA's privileges and interests. We are pleased with the resolution, which ensures any questioning of our former employee will take place in the presence of our general counsel on a reasonable, agreed-upon time frame. We are gratified that the Second Circuit's ruling provided us with the opportunity to successfully resolve this dispute." Now, Jim Jordan, being the, kind of knucklehead that he is, immediately took to Twitter and, started crowing about, well, Bragg caved. But I don't think...
But it's his agreement.
Right. He clearly, I think, gave up a lot of what he was seeking to do in a sort of unconstrained manner. So I think this is, what we had talked about before about the, having a legitimate legislative purpose to issue the subpoena was so broad. I think there was some understanding that, this was a delaying tactic that, if taken to its sort of final state, would result in Pomerantz having to testify. So I think cutting a deal like this is advantageous in setting the contours and the timing in particular of that testimony. And
to be able to have the general counsel present is a huge thing too.
Right. And I don't know, again, when they finally get Pomerantz
Jim
in a
Jordan
room,
caved.
Right. And never, notwithstanding whatever, I don't know what is Jim Jordan? What are the House Republicans what do they think they're going to extract from Pomerantz? That Trump should have been prosecuted for more? That there was crime that Trump committed that he wasn't charged with because the DA or people in New York were politically scared? I mean,
here's what I think. Here's honestly what I think is because there's going to be general counsel there now. And Jim Jordan knows he can't ask about open and ongoing investigations. He can't ask about grand jury procedure. He can't ask about stuff that's attorney-client privileged or law enforcement privileged or work product doctrine privileged or deliberative process privileged there's a million different privileges here. And Pomerantz isn't going to be able to answer most questions. And Jim Jordan's going to use that to say they're covering things up. They're hiding things from us. We demand to know because they got $7 from the federal government in 1966 or whatever his argument is. That's what I think the end goal is, right? Is to just crow about any questions that aren't going to be answered as it being a deep state cover up and a political witch hunt and, all the typical language that we heard. And the Second Circuit mention in DA Bragg's statement, because this happened since we recorded our last show. You remember that Trump judge said, no one's above the law. Pomerantz, you have to testify tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And Bragg filed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals for a stay, and the Second Circuit granted him that stay so that he didn't have to go in and testify. Now, I thought after seeing what the Republicans did to congressional subpoenas, I was like, oh, well, file an appeal and then go en banc and then have it kicked back down and then file another appeal, like make it, run out the clock. But instead, Alvin Bragg used that time that afforded him by the Second Circuit because of that temporary stay to actually coordinate with Jim Jordan and say, here, look, these would be our demands. Are you cool with that? And of course, Jim Jordan's cool with that because, like I said, he just wants some sound bites of people refusing to answer questions so that he can, because that vacuum of knowledge allows him to insert whatever weird conspiracy theory he wants to go with.
Yeah, and it does a couple of things for Bragg, right? I mean, the first thing is you had this big variable hanging out there. Like if you're sitting there and you're trying to manage the office, you're trying to manage this massive prosecution and all the sort of pre-trial litigation that's coming up. One thing that you have then added to your plate is this sort of the looming prospect of whether or not you want to fight congressional testimony. And so by setting this up, you take one, this one whole bucket of concern and time sink and things you need to worry about. You take one thing off the table, which allows you to focus on, the rest of these very important issues that he's got to manage between now and whenever trial happens next year. But then the other thing that, this is for, at least as it's been described now, for a deposition, which in most cases is not going to be open. I mean, it will certainly be transcribed. It may or may not be videotaped, but it's interesting. I will be interested to find out whether or not the deposition, which I strongly suspect will be closed to the public, is followed up by any sort of public testimony. I can certainly envision a scenario where there's a deposition. It doesn't particularly go well for what Jim Jordan's trying to achieve. And so rather than, it was like, I went through the same thing when, going through a closed deposition first and then followed by public questioning. It gives both sides an ability to see what the other side is going to say and ask and do. And if Jim Jordan takes a look at this and says, wow, this really doesn't help us, it's much better if I kind of, pick and choose like he did, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, potentially the letter signed by these, scores of former intelligence officers about, whether or not Hunter Biden's laptop might have been influenced as part of a Russian disinformation operation. It gives you the ability to selectively leak information to paint it in the best possible light, which Jordan has shown himself willing to do time and time again. So again, I don't know. If you had to ask me, are we ever going to see any public testimony by Pomerantz? I think there's a pretty decent chance they go into this closed deposition, and the best we see are portions of a transcript from a closed session that gets released by either the Democrats or the Republicans.
Yeah, and it'll be cherry-picked and released by Republicans, and then the Democrats will come out and show you the entire thing. And speaking of videotaping depositions, Jim Jordan lost a battle with the Department of Justice over some committee testimony on that front, but we need to take a quick break, so we'll come back and tell you about that right after this. Hey, everybody, welcome back. All right, in other Jim Jordan committee news, the Washington Post is reporting this week that Jim Jordan has agreed not to videotape a transcribed interview with a mid-level FBI employee. So the FBI employee was the first witness to appear before the committee who was not videotaped because the Justice Department said on Monday that they would cancel the appearance if Jim Jordan insisted on videotaping. And there's reasons for this, right? Because Jordan's team has not provided the Justice Department with an informational need for videos, first of all. But a lawyer for Jill Sanborn, who is the former assistant director of the FBI's National Security Branch, who was previously videotaped in an interview by Jim Jordan's committee, her lawyer sent a letter to lawyers for the Judiciary Committee and the FBI earlier this month that raised concerns about, quote, apparent technical glitches in the video recording of Sanborn's appearance in February, unquote. She noted 2 sections of Sanborn's interview are missing from the recording entirely. I'm sure it was just a technical error, right? I mean, I'm sure that's exactly what happened, just technical errors. But like you said in the previous segment, this tracks with Jim Jordan's misrepresentation of that testimony that Anthony Blinken solicited a letter from former intelligence community officials about Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020. So let's talk a little bit about this and this sort of misrepresentation, like obvious misrepresentation of the facts and testimony. I would almost be like, if I'm Pomerantz, I'd be like, videotape this shit. I want this videotaped by my people, right? Which is a lot of what we saw, oddly, during the January 6th committee depositions, where lawyers demanded that their lawyers videotape these depositions, so because they thought that their the things that were shown during the January 6th committee were somehow doctored or edited or cherry-picked or taken out of context. So every accusation is a confession, right?
Yeah, of course it is. And I mean, look, some background to this. I mean, it's one thing when you have private individuals and what they may or may not want to do, but when you're calling in government employees, particularly mid-level, non-senior executive government employees, there is no history of Congress videotaping closed depositions. I mean, first off, there's a transcript, right? Every single deposition, every single closed hearing, there is not, I shouldn't say every, but most that I've certainly participated in or familiar with that others have done. When you sit down, either in a closed setting context where it's not open to the public or where it's broadcast or open to the public, there's a reporter there and everything gets put down into a transcription that you can sit down and review. And if you need to make corrections or edits, you can do that. So it's not like there's not a record of this, right? It's already likely under oath. There's already a record of what was said or not said. And to the point of like, why do you need a videotape? And in my experience, it's never videotaped. Like my closed interview by the House Judiciary and Oversight Committee was not videotaped. None of the people I worked with, their closed testimony was videotaped. This is not the norm. And it is, so one, you have this, something that's never been done where, stumbling Jim Jordan walks in without his, suit jacket on and wants to videotape it. And I'm glad the department said, fuck you. You're not going to videotape this. You don't have any need that you've been able to demonstrate why you want to tape it. And furthermore, you've got Jill, who's she was the EAD. She was, she was a fairly senior ranking FBI official who has turned around and looked at this videotape and said, you know what, there are two whole segments that are missing. And what I'm very curious, again, you take it at face value that, we messed up, but I'd be really interested to compare what was videotaped with the transcription of the whole thing and see what the delta is, right? To see what those two areas were
what's
that were
missing.
videotaped.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
it again, and to the point, like this is just, Jim Jordan has no credibility left. This is coming on the heels where, they brought in all of these, there were 51 former intelligence officers who sat down and wrote a letter talking essentially
let's talk about that because I have some questions about that.
Yeah. So the background on this, like October 2020, 51 former intelligence officers signed on to a public letter. Essentially, then it stated that the appearance of Hunter Biden's laptop story on the political scene had what they called, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. Now, keep in mind, 51 former intelligence officers, not current government employees, not members of the deep state, private citizens who all sat down and decided to write a letter. Now, that's the truth. It isn't what you would hear coming out of Jim Jordan's mouth because he and Mike Turner said, well, Anthony Blinken, who was working for the Biden camp, called Mike Morrell, who's a former CIA deputy director, and asked him to write the letter. But as it turns out, again, a letter by 51 private individuals, right? As it turns out, that's not what happened. And Democrats on the committee, of course, turned around and produced a transcript saying, oh, look, as it turns out, when asked if Blinken directed him to write a letter or statement on this topic, the transcript reads that Morrell responded, my memory is that he did not, right? My memory is that he asked what I thought. And so, again, Jim Jordan, to the extent he, had any credibility left, he continues to just lay down this path of misrepresentation after misrepresentation. And I don't, all it does is point to just the, in my opinion, the absolute bad intent and ill intent to misinform and mislead the American public that's coming from what Jim Jordan did. And the broader question is what? That's election interference? 51 private citizens wrote a letter?
That's my question.
Based on their experience, they think it has the hallmarks of Russian disinformation? So the fuck what?
If I see this as a in court, like a lawsuit, and somebody has to do a filing. The way I see the DOJ breaking this down is, first of all, here is the testimony, sworn testimony. No, it wasn't solicited. It wasn't hinted at. Nobody asked for the letter, etc. It was a call asking about what Morrell thought. But, and then we see this in court filings all the time, even if a campaign official named Anthony Blinken had asked 51 private people to write a letter about what they thought of the Hunter Biden laptop, that is still not election interference. It's just not. So you know how they do that in court filings? Like, first of all, here's the truth. But even if the lie were true.
Assuming arguendo it is, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I just don't understand, because to me, and I tried to explain, like, all right, look, if now the Secretary of State and, some people like helped the Biden campaign get current intelligence officials to write a letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, without it just being a spontaneous report coming out of the IC. Okay, that's weird. I still don't think it's illegal. Might be some Hatch Act violations there, but like, I don't quite understand how people are making the jump. I mean, I guess it's, it's the target audience just doesn't understand that is not election interference.
Yeah, but it's nonsense, right? Because I mean, there are a group of former general officers who sat down and wrote an editorial that was critical of Joe Biden and positive towards Donald Trump, and nobody was accusing them of election interference. I mean, there's some question about, well, do you want senior military officers, uniformed military officers, general officers writing something like this? And I would argue that's a very different, there's a strong separation of the civilian and uniformed military sort of tradition of political involvement that I think is very different from a bunch of retirement government executives. But what you have a bunch of teachers writing a letter supporting one candidate or other. You have a bunch of ex-governors writing a letter of support one way or the other. You have a series of ex-intelligence officers writing a letter one way or the other. That's the American political process.
You would kill endorsements.
That's the core of the First Amendment, right? So to sit there and say, well, they shouldn't have written it. And of course, the people doing it are the people screaming about cancel culture. There are people screaming about how, there's just, it makes no sense to me. It isn't election interference, and it should be, anybody who's gone through any election ever understands this is very much part and parcel of what goes on. And if anything, this is a lot, in my view, far less political than a lot of the crap that gets shoveled onto the, any given election cycle. So it's bullshit,
yeah,
I think.
Very, very true.
It's clear.
And by the way, I still think that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian op. But that's, am I interfering with the 2024 election by saying that? Because according to Jim
Jordan's going to slap you with a subpoena to, videotape. I'm going to videotape you, Allison Gill.
Awesome. My left side is my best side. Election interference is calling the Secretary of State of Georgia and telling them to find you 11,780 votes and threatening law enforcement action against that Secretary of State if he doesn't do it. That's election interference. And so, I mean, obviously, this is just a, distract and reward situation, right? Like these particular Fox News viewers, Jim Jordan stans are like, it's like training a dog, right? It's like, oh, look over here, good boy, and you get a treat. So, and your treat is rage, because that is addictive. So that's just kind of the way that I see it. But I can't, you and I are going to continue covering this weaponization committee, the oversight committee, the judiciary committee in the House, and we are going to continue to see cherry-picked disinformation to formulate conspiracy theories about deep state witch hunt operations, because we know that Trump now is conspiring with Jim Jordan and Republicans in the House so that they can act as a group of defense attorneys for the public.
Yeah, and we'll see, as I have every expectation that that's only going to ramp up if in whatever point in time that, in particular, Jack Smith brings charges, this is just going to get turned up to 11. So, I guess the good news for the general American population is that, Jim Jordan is just destroying whatever little credibility he had. As time goes on, just each hearing, it just lowers and lowers that to the point that I think it largely becomes background noise, except for those people who, it's designed for, but whose minds you weren't going to change anyway. So,
that shit can help you win a primary, but it can't, it hurts you in the general. So
exactly.
Yeah. All right. And the polls are out. I mean, we saw it in 2022. There was no red wave because everybody was sick of that shit. So I think that trend will continue. So yeah, keep at it, Jim. Good job. All right. I want to talk to you, Pete, a little bit about Jack Teixeira, because there's some really explosive reporting about how and when and how widely this information was disseminated. It's an update, but we need to take a quick break before we do that. So stick around. We'll be right back. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Pete, it's worse than we thought. That Discord user, Teixeira, Massachusetts Air National Guardsman, apparently disseminated classified documents 8 months earlier than we thought when he was arrested. And that's just days after Russia invaded Ukraine. And it was to a much wider audience. Instead of a few dozen, it was to over 600 people. And it had instant access to YouTube. So can we talk about this a little bit? Because this seems to be a very different case than what we thought, or, just from the information that we had a week ago.
Yeah. And, one quick observation off the bat, it's always hard, any investigation, it's kind of like you're going into a foggy landscape, right? You don't know what the facts are. You don't know exactly what you're looking at. You don't know how far and how deep it goes, whether it just stops at, halfway down the block, or if you go down there and all of a sudden you're looking a mile down the road and it's something very, very deep. So one, uncovering additional information as you go along like this is typical. But two, what we're seeing and hearing in the public is that which, some great investigative reporting by the New York Times in particular, and some other Bellingcat and some other folks. But it also, is there's some question about to what extent even we know everything that the government may know at this point. But we're talking, there was a publicly listed YouTube channel that a large number of people had access to. And we're talking 600 potential people rather than just 50. And it goes way back to just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what the reason we know this is because the New York Times put together a series of posts that they were able to assemble to a user which they have identified with Teixeira. And it's made under, somebody who was leaking the information said, they worked at an Air Force intelligence unit. The details that are in these videos and photographs that the New York Times reviewed clearly matched images that we now know came out of the Teixeira home. But, among the more really, really concerning things to me is beyond the fact that this goes way back, much earlier than we thought, with a much greater targeted audience. There's some information that at one point he offered to share information privately with members of the group who were living outside of the United States. And the New York Times even quoted in there some post where he said, hey, look, DM me and I can tell you what I have, to somebody living outside the United States. That
was the glaring standout piece of this to me, because that takes us out of 793 territory into 794 territory. And we're going to talk, I'm hoping you can talk to us a little bit, because you have massive experience in this area, about what the differences there are.
Yeah. So when you talk about the statutes for disclosures of classified information, there's two main statutes that come in. I mean, there are several, but the two big ones are Title 18, both Section 793 and 794. 793, some people call it espionage light. I think of it more as sort of like the statute that covers mishandling and unauthorized disclosures, right? It's what, if you take something home that you shouldn't, if you share something with your neighbor that you shouldn't.
Some people actually refer to 951 as espionage light, but I call that FARA on steroids, honestly.
Right. Yeah, I think that's more right. I think that's right. But so in most cases, what you don't have in 793 is any sort of element of a foreign power, right? An individual who is a representative of any foreign government. And that's what appears in 794, which is the primary espionage statute. If you think about people like Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen or, Nicholson or, Anamonte, any number of people, they were charged and found guilty of violating 794. And what makes 794 and the elements of the crime particularly different in this whole host of statutes is you have an element of needing the involvement of a foreign power, or belief of the involvement of a foreign power. And the way the statute is written is you need to believe that either A, what you're doing is going to help a foreign power, and that B, that it's going to be used to the detriment of the United States, that somehow by disclosing it, you're going to harm the United States. And there are other things, right? It has to be information relating to the national defense and the other things you have to satisfy for the statute. But what makes 794 a particularly heavy hitting, and in terms of a hit, 793 is max at 10 years. 794 is up to life in prison or death if the disclosure leads to the death of a human source, and there's some other nuclear satellite type carve-outs for making it a capital offense. But when you look at what Teixeira allegedly said, where somebody outside the United States, that presumably there's some information he understood them to be outside the United States, and he's nevertheless providing information to them, that raises a whole, I mean, one, it brings 794 into play, but in terms of damage to the United States, it really ups the potential harm. And again, keep in mind, 794 doesn't say it has to be a hostile foreign nation. It's any foreign power. So it could be Russia, but it could be Ukraine, right? It could be China, but it could be France. It doesn't, the statute is agnostic as to who the foreign power is, just merely that it is an agent of a foreign power. So it's concerning to me from a national security perspective, much more than anything else I've seen in this case to date. And it also potentially brings into play statutes that were not, implicated before, and a whole bunch of questions from that, right? Like what more is there that even the New York Times doesn't know about? Did the FBI know about this before the New York Times found it? How was it that all this information was out there?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because this is apparently from New York Times investigatory reporting. And the chain of digital evidence, it says, collected by the Times, ties these posts containing the sensitive information to Teixeira. The posts were made under a username that the New York Times has previously connected to Teixeira. The person leaking the information said he worked at a U.S. Air Force intelligence unit, like Teixeira does. Details in videos and photographs he posted matched images posted by family members inside the Teixeira home. So this is the Times really digging into this. Fellow Discord members sent this user who posted these documents birthday wishes on December 21st, which is the same date Airman Teixeira's sister wished him a happy birthday on Facebook. And he posted a photograph of an antique German rifle for which the Times found an online receipt with Teixeira's name on it. So, and apparently he appeared to be posting from the military base where he was stationed. In one conversation, he said he was about to enter a skiff. And at one point, he offered to share information privately with members of the group living outside the U.S., like you said. And that got us into the 794 discussion. In your tenure, looking at these kinds of crimes and doing counterintelligence, what are some of the sentences you've seen for people who violated 794? Because you said it's 793 is up to 10 years, but 794 could be any number of years to life or death.
Yeah, I mean, certainly beyond 10 years, right? I mean, I think there are things where the things where you see life sentences are people who have consciously entered into a witting asset relationship with a foreign power, right? I mean, Robert Hansen knew that he was working for the Russians. He agreed to work for him. He was getting paid by them. Same with Aldrich James, same with Ana Montes and the Cubans. I mean, these are the harshest penalties are reserved for those people who truly are spies, right? They agree to work with a foreign power. What I've seen is Teixeira, and again, with a huge, huge asterisk that we only know what we're seeing through the New York Times and others, is he wasn't particularly sophisticated. It sure seems like some dummy who was trying to get attention and adulation from others and decided to, because it was interesting and neat, that he was going to share the classified information that he had at work. The issue is, and I don't know, I mean, well, presumably investigators will come up with some idea of whether or not he understood just how bad it could be to be leaking this information in the context of a wartime environment in Ukraine and the impact of that and whether or not he cared. Again, I think before this information about the foreign power, I was envisioning something, a plea deal where maybe he got 2 to 4 years. Again, assuming we knew all the facts that existed. But now
that's what we both thought last week, right? When we had limited knowledge of what was happening. When we did make the caveat that this is with the current information that we have now, Yeah,
this kicks it up. And so the question is what was, did he in fact, he made this offer to DM me, but can the FBI sort of investigate and, was there any follow-up on that? Did somebody in Ukraine or Russia or pretending to be in Ukraine, really in St. Petersburg, wherever they were, was there actually a follow-up? Was there a DM exchange where Teixeira provided information or responded to a request? I mean, if you have that, in my mind, you're very much, I mean, that escalates things sentence-wise and gravity-wise significantly. If there's no evidence.
Yeah, because at first it was just photos, right? Or he would just relay the information, and then there were printed out documents and photos. And like you said, if one of those foreign folks in that DM that maybe DM'd him said, hey, print those out for me, and he goes and does it, then we're kicking it up even more. So this could it's been kicked up. It could be kicked up even more. This might be the top end of it. We really don't know.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of people, interestingly, on kind of across the board, sort of jumping on this poor little 21-year-old kid, wasn't loved enough at home and was just seeking affirmation from all these other little fellow gaming nerds online and wanted to be sort of like the omniscient alpha dog that knew everything about what was going on in Ukraine. But so one, there's a lot of assumption going into that, in fact, that was his motivation. But two, again, if there is any sort of indication that why did he DM? Why not just talk about it in the channel? Well, you DM because you want to hide it. Why do you hide it? Because it's wrong. I mean, this all goes to sort of like establishing intent and the knowledge that it could harm the United States or help a foreign nation. And if there is any sort of provision of like, here's the, what do you have? Well, here's the stuff that I have. Oh, neat. Can I get item 2 and 6? God forbid there's something like that going on. But if there is, I think everybody, and particularly the media, needs to take a real hard reset, sort of look at the perspective of Teixeira. And again, if that's on the worst case, best case, he sits there and says, God, I really fucked up. His attorney makes a good deal, gives complete debriefs, and what he's saying lines up exactly with the forensic trail that the FBI is able to establish through YouTube and Discord and everywhere else. He sits down, he takes and passes a polygraph that, the best case is he was, in fact, just a stupid kid who got wrapped up in something and wasn't thinking through the sort of logical consequences of his actions, and he never actively tried to assist any foreign power, and everybody's comfortable. That's on one side. But there's a lot we don't know right now. And, to the extent of like, if you think about trying to understand the span of risk from like how bad is it to what's the least it could be, this sort of DMing with a foreign group, just that far into the risk, just exponentially expands that out to the bad side of things. So more to come. I think he's got a detention hearing on Wednesday, today, as you're listening to it, in Worcester, which is, out in central Massachusetts. It's not in Boston, where the judge that was assigned happened to sit for his initial appearance. So he's going to be schlepping out to Central Mass for a detention hearing. And I'm curious. I mean, I can certainly see a scenario where he is granted bail, but if the government is going to seek to have him detained, that's where I might expect to see sort of additional detail of like why, if there is a foreign link, that the government might show a little leg in explaining why there is a foreign link as a reason to keep him detained. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and of course, as a former government supervisor with tons of direct reports, my first question is, give me the training logs. Did he take the insider threat training? Did he take all of his training? Because, the thing about the government, the way that it works is, just a little bit of behind the curtains here, is if I wanted to continue to have my CAC card work, which is what allows me to sign into my computer, my training has to be up to date. And you can't cheat on the training. You have to sit through it and answer the questions, and it's interactive, and you have to do it annually, sometimes semi-annually, or biannually, twice a year. Anyway, there's no way around the training, right? Like you can't just sort of shirk your way out of it. And that's for a reason. So as a former supervisor, my first thing, I'd be pulling those training logs to see if he took that training, and then be asking him questions about that. But we'll see how this goes. I'm sure more information will come out. We'll know if this is the top or if it gets broader. But I think that's a really good point that you're making, that the argument to remand him pre-trial is going to probably tell us a little bit more about how serious this is.
Yeah, and the government may not know, right? And if they don't know, they're going to err on the side of safety. I mean, the conditions, revoking bail or not granting bail at the federal system, at least, there are two things to consider. One is threat to the community, and two is risk of flight, that somebody's going to take off. Now, risk to the community, you might think, well, is it a violent offender? If they're released, are they going to go, attack more people, assault more family members? But in this case, threat to the community could be, does he have additional classified information in his possession that the government does not yet have or know about that he could release, harming the community? So that is is one leg of how that might be argued. The second leg, of course, is flight. Does he have a passport? Can he surrender the passport? Does he have the financial wherewithal to travel? Does he have local family versus does he have family or ties abroad? What I've seen kind of argues against detention, certainly on the risk of flight. But again, if the government is comfortable, they may not oppose bail. If they either have concerns and or don't know, I can see them arguing, and they're going to have to come up with some stuff, some information, some argument to the court why he should be detained.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is our show, everybody. The E. Jean Carroll trial begins this week. Tomorrow for us as we record this, yesterday for you as you listen. We're going to cover it in the next episode, including the Second Circuit decision, refusing to decide whether Donald was acting in his capacity as president. Remember the DOJ, Barr came in when Barr was in charge, and he said the Department of Justice will be subbing for Trump. We were going to be representing the Trump side because he was acting in his capacity as president when he defamed E. Jean. And then the Second Circuit said no, and then we should send this to D.C. because it's you guys are the experts at this, and this is a huge public interest, and it has to do with the president. D.C. Circuit just came back. It sat there for a long time, but D.C. Circuit just came back and said, we're not deciding this. You guys figure it out. It's up to the fact finders, which is a jury. So we're going to see if these trials are deconsolidated, whatever, separated, and maybe Carroll 1 and Carroll 2 are heard by two different juries, or if their jury's going to hear this. We'll know more next week, and we'll talk about that. But do you have any final thoughts before we get out of here?
No, it's going to be interesting. Have you heard how long they expect the trial to take? I think I heard 2 weeks, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it was 1 to 2 weeks is the reporting I got. And that's interesting. That's short. Of course, they went back and forth quite a bit to decide whether or not Donald Trump would even be there.
Yeah, we
Donald
still don't
Trump
know.
And Joey Tacopina was trying to get a jury instruction that would have told the jurors to not draw any negative inferences by Donald Trump's absence. And the judge said, no, you can't do that. The jury can draw whatever inferences they want, or you can bring that up during trial. But right now it's hypothetical. It's not ripe for that discussion. And then as we know, they kept trying to get the jurors' names and phone numbers so that they could probably intimidate them. But it's so far the judge is probably already really sick and tired of Joey Taco Pizza. So we'll see how it. I don't think it's going to go too well for them. But 1 to 2 weeks. Unlike the Proud Boys trial, which took 3 months. It just wrapped up today.
Yeah, wrapping up today. Right, closing arguments.
Anyway, we'll be talking about that and probably a bunch of other Jim Jordan shenanigans next week. Thanks so much, everybody, and thanks to our patrons. You make the show happen. We'll talk to you next time. Cleanup on Aisle 45 is written, researched, and produced by Allison Gill, with editing by Molly Hockey. Our art and logo design are by Joelle Reeder and Moxie Design Studios, and our music is composed and performed by Adam Orr. Cleanup on Aisle 45 is a proud member of the MSW Media Network, a collection of creator-owned podcasts dedicated to news, politics, and justice. For more information, visit mswmedia.com. MSW Media.